May 22, 1943. The North Atlantic, 240 miles southwest of Iceland. Lieutenant Commander William Drane is currently violating every safety protocol in the United States Navy Flight Manual. He is strapped into the cockpit of a TBF Avenger torpedo bomber, a 14,000-pound beast of aluminum and hydraulic fluid that was designed to drop torpedoes from a stable, level flight path. But William Drane is not flying level. He is shoving the stick forward, forcing the Avenger's nose down into a screaming 20-degree power dive directly at the surface of the ocean. Through the oil-smeared windscreen, the target is growing rapidly. It is a dark, jagged scar on the gray water. U-569, a German-type 7C U-boat. In 1943, the conventional wisdom of anti-submarine warfare was simple. Stay high, stay safe. Pilots were taught to attack from 400 feet, dropping depth charges in a level run to avoid the lethal envelope of the submarine as anti-aircraft guns. To dive directly at a surfaced U-boat was considered suicide. The U-boat was not a helpless target. It was a floating flak battery. As Drane's airspeed indicator climbs past 200 knots, the German crew on the conning tower reacts with disciplined ferocity. They swing their dual 20-millimeter cannons skyward. These are not panic shots. These are calculated, high-velocity streams of high-explosive incendiary shells designed to shred the fabric control surfaces of an aircraft and turn the pilot into pink mist. Tracer rounds arc upward in lazy streaks that accelerate into white-hot lines as they scream past Drane's canopy. The altimeter unwinds. 600 feet, 400 feet, 200 feet. At this altitude, there is no margin for error. If Drane pulls up too late, he hits the water. If he drops his ordnance too early, the explosion will rip his own tail off. If he flinches from the wall of lead flying at his face, he misses the target, and the U-boat slips away to kill another merchant ship. The Avenger shudders as anti-aircraft shells punch through her wing fabric. In the tunnel position behind Drane, his radio man trains a camera downward, documenting what naval doctrine said couldn't be done. Drane pushes the nose over steeper. The U-boat fills his gun sight. He is now close enough to see the faces of the German gunners. They are firing straight at him. At 100 feet above the waves, an altitude usually reserved for landing, traveling at nearly 230 miles per hour, he punches the release. 4 Mark 47 depth bombs tumble from the bomb bay. They do not drift. They do not glide. Driven by the momentum of the dive, they strike the water in a precise kinetic line, straddling U-569's pressure hull, just aft of her conning tower. The submarine's stern lifts violently from the sea as the Torpex charges detonate 25 feet below the surface. Drane wrenches the Avenger into a screaming left turn, his vision graying at the edges from the gee forces. Behind him, a massive geyser of white water erupts. U-569's bow rises vertically, a steel tombstone marking its own grave, before she slides backward into the crushing depths. What William Drane and his squadron mates from Composite Squadron Nine had just proven would fundamentally change how the U.S. Navy hunted German submarines. They had unlocked the secret to breaking the U-boat's immunity. But the cost of this knowledge was high. It demanded that American pilots fly straight into the teeth of withering anti-aircraft fire at altitudes where a single mistake meant certain death. To understand why this suicidal maneuver was necessary, we must first understand the desperate mathematics of the Battle of the Atlantic in the spring of 1943. By early 1943, the Allied war effort was bleeding out in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. The strategic situation was defined by a single brutal metric: tonnage. Great Britain was an island nation that imported over 1 million tons of material a week to survive and fight. Food, fuel, ammunition, aluminum, rubber, every ounce of it had to cross an ocean infested with the most effective submarine force in history. Grand Admiral Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, knew he didn't need to defeat the British Navy in a pitched battle. He just needed to solve a math problem. If his U-boats could sink Allied merchant ships faster than American and British shipyards could replace them, Britain would starve. The invasion of Europe would be impossible. The war would be lost before a single Allied soldier set foot in France. In the first 3 months of 1943 alone, the Wolfpacks sent 108 ships, totaling over 600,000 tons, to the bottom of the Atlantic. The exchange rate was catastrophic. For every U-boat the Allies managed to sink, the Germans were launching 2 more. For every merchant ship the Allies built, the Germans were sinking 2. The Allied supply lines were stretching to the breaking point. Their gap, that terrifying stretch of mid-Atlantic Ocean, beyond the range of land-based bombers, had become a slaughterhouse. The problem, however, wasn't just a lack of aircraft. By March 1943, the United States Navy had begun deploying a new weapon, the escort carrier, or CVE. These were not the fleet carriers of the Pacific, the fast, armored leviathans like the Enterprise or the Yorktown. These were converted merchant hulls, affectionately and sometimes derisively known as jeep carriers, or baby flattops. Ships like the USS Bogue, the USS Card, and the USS Core were slow, thin-skinned, and rolled heavily in the Atlantic swells. But they carried a deadly cargo: composite squadrons of TBF Avenger torpedo bombers and F-4F Wildcat fighters. On paper, this should have been checkmate. The Avengers were purpose-built killers. Each one could haul 4 depth bombs in its cavernous bomb bay and patrol for over 5 hours at ranges exceeding 1,000 miles. They carried the Mark 24 Fido homing torpedo and the powerful Mark 47 depth bomb. But having the right hardware didn't mean having the right software. The doctrine was broken. The standard anti-submarine attack doctrine of 1942 called for caution. It was a set of tactics written by peacetime officers who prioritized the safety of the aircraft over the destruction of the target. Pilots were instructed to fly level approaches at altitudes between 300 and 500 feet. The theory was sound in a classroom. Stay high enough to avoid the worst of the enemy flak, maintain stable flight for an accurate bomb release, and ensure the aircraft didn't get caught in the blast radius of its own depth charges. In practice, against the hardened veterans of the Kriegsmarine, it was proving catastrophically ineffective. German U-boat commanders were not passive victims. They had learned to exploit the geometry of these high-altitude attacks. When a U-boat lookout spotted an aircraft at 400 feet making a level run, the submarine had time. First, the time between visual acquisition and weapon release gave the submarine crews precious seconds to crash dive. A well-drilled German crew could clear the bridge and get the boat underwater in 30 seconds. By the time the depth charges from a high-flying Avenger hit the water, the submarine was already 50 or 60 feet down and diving hard. The standard 100-foot depth setting on the charges meant the bonds exploded harmlessly above their targets, rattling the hull but failing to crack it. Second, and perhaps more dangerously, the horizontal approach gave U-boat gunners an extended, stable firing solution. A plane flying straight and level at 400 feet is a skeet target. It allows the gunners to track, lead, and fill the sky with defensive fire. Squadron commanders studying after-action reports noted a troubling pattern. Nearly every attack that failed to sink a U-boat shared common characteristics: high approach altitude, level flight path, excessive standoff distance, slow closure speed. The statistics were damning. Depth charges dropped from altitude, often ricocheted off the water at speeds above 200 knots, skipping over submarines like stones across a pond. At the prescribed altitudes, the spacing between the bombs was too wide to guarantee a kill. A straddle might mean one bomb hit 50 feet off the port bow and another 50 feet off the starboard quarter, close enough to scare the crew, but not close enough to breach the pressure hull. And every failed attack meant the submarine escaped. It meant the Wolfpack remained intact. It meant another tanker burned. Another crew froze to death in the oil-slicked water. To make matters worse, the Germans were evolving. Admiral Dönitz realized that aircraft were becoming a threat, but he also realized they were timid. In May 1943, U-Boat High Command issued a new directive: fight back. They began equipping submarines with enhanced anti-aircraft armament, the Term 4 conversion. This upgrade replaced the single 20mm gun with dual and even quadruple 20mm cannon mounts, known as flakeveiling. Submarines no longer crash-dived immediately when they spotted an aircraft. Instead, they remained surfaced. They turned their sterns to the attacker to present a smaller target and unleashed a wall of steel. They were betting that Allied pilots lacked the nerve to press home an attack through that concentrated fire. And for a long time, they were right. Doctrine explicitly warned pilots against low-altitude approaches. Training emphasized survival over aggression. Attack runs from 400 feet meant relative safety for aircrews, but it also meant the U-boat survived to kill again. For the pilots of Composite Squadron 9 BC-9 embarked on the USS Bogue, the disconnect between their training and the reality of the Atlantic War became impossible to ignore. They had endured the tedious crossing from Norfolk to Iceland. They had flown dawn-to-dusk patrols in weather that turned cockpits into iceboxes. They had spotted U-boats attacked by the book and watched in frustration as their targets slipped beneath the waves, damaged but alive. The pilots of VC-9 were not politicians or strategists. They were engineers of violence, and they realized their system was failing. They needed a new variable. They needed a tactic that stripped the U-boat of its advantageous time and stability. What they needed was speed. And to get speed, they had to embrace gravity. The answer, when it came, would seem obvious in retrospect. But in May 1943, it required a fundamental rethinking of everything the Navy taught about anti-submarine warfare. It required the pilots to turn their Avengers into dive bombers. This was not what the Avenger was built for. It was a torpedo bomber designed for low, slow approaches against battleships. But VC-9 realized that if they initiated a steep dive from a lower altitude, they could achieve two things. First, they could compress the time of the attack. A dive from 600 feet to 100 feet at 200 knots takes seconds. It denied the U-boat crew the time to clear the bridge and dive. It forced them to fight. Second, and crucial to their survival, the steep angle disrupted the German gunners' aim. The flak crews on the U-boats were trained to track targets moving horizontally across the horizon. They were not trained to track a target falling out of the sky directly on top of them at 300 feet per second. The elevation gears on the 20mm cannons couldn't track fast enough. But there was a catch. There is always a catch in logistics. Dropping a depth bomb from a diving aircraft at 200 knots creates a physics problem. If the bomb hits the water at that speed and angle, it doesn't sink. It skips. It ricochets off the surface tension of the water like a flat rock, tumbling into the air and exploding harmlessly hundreds of yards away. VC-9 had to solve the Ricochet Problem, and the solution they found was terrifying. The physics of a depth bomb are unforgiving. Unlike a torpedo, which has a propeller, or a guided missile, which has fins, a depth bomb is a dumb canister of explosives. It is subject to the laws of ballistics and fluid dynamics. When a cylindrical object hits the water at 250 knots at a shallow angle, the surface tension of the ocean acts like concrete. The bomb does not penetrate. It skips. It ricochets off the waves, tumbling wildly into the air, often exploding hundreds of yards past the target or worse, detonating in the air behind the aircraft, shredding the very plane that dropped it. The pilots of VC-9 realized that to make the diving attack work, they had to solve a lethal paradox. They needed the dive to close the distance and throw off the German gunner's aim. But they needed to be slow when they released the weapon to ensure it bit into the water and sank. Every instinct in a combat pilot's brain screams for speed. Speed is life. Speed is what keeps the flak from hitting you. But the solution VC-9 developed demanded the opposite. The new protocol was counterintuitive and terrifying. A pilot would initiate the dive at high speed to close the gap. But at the critical moment, just as the German 20mm tracers were thickening around the cockpit, the pilot had to cut the throttle. Some pilots, in a desperate bid to kill their kinetic energy, would even drop their landing gear in the middle of a combat dive. They would deploy the wheels to act as improvised airbrakes, creating massive drag to decelerate the 14-ton Avenger from 240 knots down to 180 knots in a matter of seconds. Imagine the nerve required. You are flying head-on into a wall of anti-aircraft fire. You are 100 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, and you deliberately slow your aircraft down to the stall speed of a Cessna, making yourself a larger, slower target just to ensure your math is right. This was the mundane savior of the anti-submarine war, the willingness to pull the throttle back in the face of death. The theory was sound. The practice was proven on the afternoon of May 22nd. Lieutenant William F. Chamberlain was flying a patrol sector when the USS Bogue, high-frequency direction finder, Huff-Duff, picked up a sharp spike. A U-boat was transmitting. It was reporting the position of convoy ON-184. Chamberlain didn't climb to 400 feet. He didn't set up a level bombing run. He shoved the throttle forward and dropped right down to the wave tops, hiding his Avenger in the sea clutter of the U-boat's own radar. Ahead of him, U-569 was cruising on the surface, her diesel engines pounding, racing to get ahead of the convoy. Her lookouts were scanning the horizon, looking for the masts of destroyers. They never looked up. They never saw the Avenger until it was less than a mile away. When the alarm bells finally rang inside the pressure hull, it was too late. The German gunners scrambled to the winter garden, swinging the twin 20mm cannons around. But Chamberlain was already executing the new doctrine. He pulled up sharply, then pushed over into a 20-degree dive. To the German gunners, accustomed to leading a level target, the Avenger was a nightmare. It wasn't moving across their field of fire. It was expanding in their sights like a balloon. They couldn't depress their guns fast enough to track the diving aircraft. Chamberlain held the dive. 600 feet. 400 feet, the tracers zipped past his canopy. At 200 feet, he cut his speed. At 100 feet point-blank range, he pickled the load. 4 Mark 47 depth bombs dropped in a tight, lethal cluster. Because of the steep angle and the reduced speed, they didn't skip. They bit into the water, their noses angling down, driving deep. They bracketed the U-boat's pressure hull. The fuses were set for 25 feet. A split second later, 4,000 pounds of torpex detonated simultaneously. The shockwave was essentially a hammer blow from the hand of God. The incompressible water transmitted the force directly into the steel plates of U-569. The submarine didn't just leak. It shattered. The stern kicked violently out of the water. Inside, the lights died, pipes burst, and the men of the Kriegsmarine were thrown against the bulkheads. Captain Lieutenant Hans-Peter Hinsch knew instantly the boat was dead. He blew the ballast tanks in a desperate emergency service. U-569 broke the surface like a wounded whale, listing heavily, oil bleeding from her ruptured flanks. The crew scrambled out of the conning tower, hands raised. This was not a damaged U-boat slipping away to repair in France. This was a kill. The victory over U-569 wasn't luck. It was geometry. The intelligence officers on the USS Bogue analyzed the attack and realized why the new tactic was devastating. It came down to bomb spacing. In a standard level attack from 400 feet, the depth charges fall in a long, shallow arc. Because the plane is moving forward at 200 knots, The bombs land far apart. The first bomb might hit 100 feet ahead of the sub, and the last bomb 100 feet behind it. The lethal density, the chance of a bomb landing within the critical 20-foot kill zone of the hull, was low. But in a diving attack, the geometry changes. Because the plane is diving at the target, the bombs are released closer together in time and space. The spread compresses. Instead of landing 100 feet apart, the bombs land in a tight cluster, perhaps only 75 feet from first to last. This meant that if the pilot aimed correctly, he wasn't just hitting the submarine with one bomb. He was hitting it with a cumulative shockwave from multiple detonations. It turned a game of probability into a game of certainty. Furthermore, the dive angle served a critical defensive purpose. A level approach gave the U-boat gunners 30 to 40 seconds to acquire, track, and fire. The diving attack compressed the engagement window to less than 10 seconds. The German gunners, trained for years to shoot down level bombers, simply could not adapt their muscle memory fast enough. They were trying to shoot a falling stone. The success of VC-9 sent shockwaves through the Atlantic Fleet. Admiral Ernest King, the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Fleet, saw the reports and realized the game had changed. For 3 years, the Allies had played defense. Convoys huddled together, protected by destroyers, waiting to be attacked. The escort carriers were seen as defensive umbrellas. But now, with the diving attack proven, King authorized a strategic shift. He unleashed the hunter-killer groups. Escort carriers like the Bogue, the Card, and the Core were ordered to stop hugging the convoys. They were authorized to go on the offensive. Using ultra-intelligence, decoded German Enigma messages, they began to hunt the hunters. Their primary targets were the milk cows, the Type 14 supply submarines. These were massive, lumbering U-boats that carried fuel and torpedoes to resupply the attack boats in mid-ocean, allowing them to stay on station for months. The milk cows were fat targets, and now the Avengers knew how to kill them. Between May and August 1943, the escort carrier groups went on a rampage. They sank 17 U-boats. Crucially, they sank 5 of the milk cows. This was a logistical catastrophe for Germany. When a milk cow was sunk, it wasn't just the loss of one boat. It forced a dozen attack U-boats, running low on fuel and torpedoes, to abort their patrols and return to base. It effectively swept the Atlantic clean of the Wolfpacks. The numbers tell the story of the collapse. In May 1943, the Germans lost 38 U-boats. By the end of the year, they had lost 237. Admiral Dönitz, looking at his sinking charts, realized the impossible had happened. The Atlantic, once a German hunting ground, had become a graveyard. The exchange rate had flipped. It was now costing Germany more submarines to sink a ship than the ship was worth. By mid-1943, Dönitz was forced to do the unthinkable. He ordered his U-boats to withdraw from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The Black May of 1943 marked the turning point of the entire naval war. And the tip of the spear was the escort carrier. These jeep carriers, built on merchant hulls and derided by the battleship admirals, accounted for 53 confirmed U-boat kills during the war. They captured the U-505, intact the only German man-of-war captured on the high seas by the U.S. Navy since 1815. Admiral Francis Lowe, Chief of Staff of the 10th Fleet, noted in 1944 that CVE support groups accounted for about 60% of all U-boats sunk by U.S. forces in the Atlantic. Conclusion: the triumph of calculated risk. The lesson of Lieutenant Commander William Drane and VC-9 is not just about ballistics or dive angles. It is a lesson about the nature of military innovation. The U.S. Navy entered the war with a doctrine designed to keep its pilots safe. Stay high, stay level. It was a sensible, bureaucratic approach to war, and it was losing. Victory required a rejection of safety. It required the pilots to look at the problem, a steel tube in the water, firing back at them, and realize that the only way to destroy it was to accept the probability of their own death. They had to fly lower than the manual allowed. They had to dive steeper than the airframe was rated for. They had to release bombs so close that the explosion rattled their own teeth. The Germans bet that the Americans were soft. They bet that the Jeep carrier pilots wouldn't have the stomach to fly into the teeth of the flak. They were wrong. The mundane savior was not a new weapon. It was a new mindset. It was the realization that in total war, the safest place to be is not at 400 feet, but at 100 feet, diving at 200 knots, with the throttle cut and the bomb bay doors open.